Good morning. This meeting of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 10 a.m. on March 16, 2018. The meeting takes place at the Commission's headquarters located at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. I'm Chair Catherine Lehman, and commissioners who are present at this meeting in addition to me are the Vice Chair, Patricia Timmons-Goodson, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Degbele. On the phone, if you could confirm you're on the line after I say your name, I believe we have Commissioner Yaki.
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Kirsnow? Okay. We do have a quorum present. Is the court reporter present?
Yes.
Thank you. Is the staff director present?
Yes.
Thank you. The meeting now comes to order. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for this business meeting?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. I'm looking for amendments. I do have a few to start us off. First, I'll move to amend to add consideration for a statement related to the fiscal year 2019 proposed budget. Are there any other amendments?
Commissioner Yaki here.
Yes?
I have two amendments. One is a potential letter regarding the immigration enforcement actions around courthouses. The second is a statement regarding the EPA decision on Uniontown, Alabama.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, Vice Chair Timmons-Goodson, I would move to amend it to include a statement regarding the Commission highlighting the need for the Department of Justice to reopen the Office of Access to Justice.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other amendments? Okay, I second the motion to amend for the amendments that I didn't offer. Is there a second for mine?
Vice Chair Timmons-Goodson, I second.
Thank you. Let's vote to approve the agenda as amended. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion passes unanimously. Okay, first we will hear some presentations from State Advisory Committee members. Our first presentation will be from Rachel Talbot Ross, a member of our Maine Advisory Committee, on the committee's recently released advisory memorandum on racial discrimination in criminal prosecution and sentencing in Maine. Ms. Ross, you have the floor. Ms. Ross, if you are speaking, you're on mute. And if you're not, I think we'll move on. If Ms. Ross joins us, we can come back to her. We'll instead hear from our Maryland Advisory Committee Chair, Tom Mackel, on the committee's recently released advisory memorandum on fees and fines and bail reform in Maryland. Chair Mackel.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for the work that you do. I am here today to talk about the Maryland Advisory Committee's advisory memorandum, specifically addressing Maryland, whether Maryland or its local jurisdictions use court-imposed financial penalties and money bail in ways that may violate the constitutional rights of persons assessed or otherwise interfere with the administration of justice. Before I proceed, I would like to just sort of give you, before I proceed to address the findings, I would just like very quickly to say that there were a couple of things that happened that brought this to our attention. The Dear Colleague letter that came from the Department of Justice, which is referenced in the event in the memorandum. The letter from the Maryland Attorney General regarding money bail, which is also referenced in the memorandum. And an earlier study by the Brennan Center concerning the use of parole supervisory fees in Maryland and its impact as a barrier for re-entry to society for people subject to those fees. This particular topic was championed by a member of the committee, Ms. Pamela Bennett, and I would like specifically to thank her for her leadership on this effort, and also would like to particularly call out and thank Barbara Delavies for her support, guidance, and energy that helped the committee get to the point that it did. I don't want to go through all the findings because I believe that you all have seen that. I would like to simply emphasize the following. Where information does exist, that information raises concerns about the racially and economic disparate impact of Maryland's system of fees and fines and money bail, and its overall impact on the administration of justice. And when we had the public briefing and testimony that we received supported concerns, for example, that were raised in the Brennan report several years ago. That's just one example. When we dug into this topic, however, I think the primary concern that we encountered, and probably the basis for the most significant recommendation going forward, is that we do not have in Maryland today any systematic or verifiable collection of information pertaining to the impact of the system of fines and fees and the money bail practices, and the extent to which they result in incarceration, let alone the extent to which they may have a disparate impact on certain groups. There is no uniform reporting system. There is no data regarding bail and pretrial detentions on the outcomes of trials. There's no real data regarding bail bondsmen's uses of extrajudicial remedies for collecting bail, and there simply is no systematic, verifiable information that is captured today in the state of Maryland that allows us to assess the extent to which these practices may result in incarceration, whether disparate or not. That lack of information was for us really a primary impediment to pursuing this project any further at this time. And if there is a concrete recommendation that comes out of this particular memorandum, it is most importantly that Maryland should address and begin to collect in a systematic and verifiable way what is the practice regarding fees and fines around the state of Maryland, and what is the extent to which those monetary penalties do result in incarceration, and to what extent does the money bail practices and pretrial detention that exists today, what extent do they have an impact on judicial outcomes? There has been some change with respect to the Maryland laws regarding money bail, where judges are expected to take into account the defendant's ability to pay as they go forward. And perhaps as that system is in place, some information will come to light that may bear re-examination of this. But this lack of information, we think, is a critical issue and needs to be addressed. And if that information is collected at some point and becomes available to the public, we believe this would be a very fertile topic for the committee to take up yet again.
Thanks very much, Chair Mackel. I want to open it up for questions from my fellow commissioners. Madam Vice Chair.
Yes, I thank you so very much for this memorandum. And I understand very clearly that your effort to look into this matter was impeded by the lack of information. My inquiry is whether the fact that you have put this out, is there any indication that you have had a positive effect in that there is proposed legislation, or perhaps I should say, is there any proposed legislation out there in any state or condition that would take care of the concern that you have?
Thank you for the question. The short answer is not that I'm aware of at this point. So I cannot answer that definitively. What I can say to you is that one of our witnesses did say that he believed that the judiciary could pull that information together and would pull that information together if directed to do so. But what is clear is even if they did so, it would not be done in a verifiable and auditable fashion. So while I can't say that there's any legislation out there at this point, certainly that would be an outcome that we would welcome following from this project.
Thank you.
Chair Mackle, this is Catherine Lehman. I need to say to you as a fellow Marylander, thank you for your service and also for taking up a topic that's obviously very important to the state and to the country and also important to this commission. It's a topic that we issued a report on last September. Want to follow up on the Vice Chair's question to you. I understand that you're not aware of pending progress now to address the data collection issue that was such an impediment to your analysis and obviously is an impediment for the state. I wonder what steps the State Advisory Committee itself is taking to try to see change in this area. It's obviously an area that has been ripe for change in the state, given the state's recent progress during the pendency of your investigation. So I'm interested in the steps that you together as a committee plan to take or are taking related to correcting this issue.
We have not defined at this point any specific steps. I think we do have a meeting scheduled later in the month of April. And perhaps that's a topic that we will address as part of that meeting as to whether there may be any appropriate or viable steps that the committee would take. So I will take your question actually as a suggestion of a way that we might move forward a little further on this topic.
Terrific.
This is Vice Chair Timmons Goodson. As another possible way that you could proceed, given that you have identified that perhaps the judges have access to that information, and while it might not, their collection of that information might not meet, statistical, rules and all of that, might that be a place that you could begin and perhaps going to the judicial council, the state's judicial council, or something, asking them to voluntarily take on such a responsibility. Now, I can almost promise you that that will not be something that they'll voluntarily take up, but it does get, it continues the discussion of the issue, and many of us are calling upon our judges to do more in this area. But just a suggestion.
Yeah, well, and thank you for the suggestion. I will tell you that I will be very frank with you that within the committee we had a number of discussions of steps that we could take next. And quite honestly, one challenge that we have is how to most efficiently allocate our time for what we believe would be the return on that time that we invest. I've just received two fine suggestions from the from the commission, and I appreciate it. And these will be topics that we will put into the discussion as we go forward.
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from the commission? With that, Chair Mackel, we really appreciate your presentation. I want to note, I believe that Commissioner Kirsnow has joined us. Could you confirm, Commissioner Kirsnow, that you're on the phone?
I am, thank you.
Terrific, welcome. And I also understand that our main advisory committee member, Rachel Talbot Ross, has called in. Ms. Ross, are you on the phone?
I am, thank you.
Terrific, thank you. We would welcome hearing your presentation on your advisory memorandum on racial discrimination and criminal prosecution and sentencing in Maine.
Well, I want to start by thanking you for this opportunity to present what we believe was a very critical investigation that, while we had the hearing back in 2014, what's really important to understand is the work that's taken place as a result of the investigation, and with your support, we've been able to move forward some of the recommendations. So I want to first start by saying thank you for this opportunity. I also have to just mention briefly that at the time that the investigation and our hearing was held, I was the chair of the State Advisory Committee. I am no longer the chair, but I am now serving in the Maine State Legislature and have been able to help move forward some of the recommendations from this group and serve on the Criminal Justice Committee for the House of Representatives. So I'm really fortunate to be able to stay very close to the work and remain a member of the State Advisory Committee. We just briefly, the impetus for this work came from actually the local NAACP that had been working in the state. We have 3 branches in the state, one in the greater Bangor area, one in the Portland area, and then we uniquely have a branch of the NAACP in our maximum security prison, which is the Maine State Prison in Warren, Maine, which has been in place for well over 20 years. But the impetus for this work came from the NAACP. And the NAACP, through the branch in the prison, was working on correctional policy and reform for years, and started to see a theme coming out of some of the work, which was these stories about convictions and what appeared to be disparate sentencing, where the only common denominator seemed to be race. The race of the defendants, which were all men of color predominantly, and then the race of the jury, which were all white. And so seeing and hearing the stories of these disparate sentencing, where race was the only common denominator, it led to a series of meetings with the judicial branch, the Department of Corrections, and law enforcement, in which the ACLU and the Maine Prisoner Advisory Commission joined us. We held a series of meetings in order to find out if we could do a pilot project that would really help analyze what was going on with these disparities. The result of those meetings were that we got connected to Cynthia Jones, who was one of the panel members who gave us the background in the national context, professor from the Washington College of Law. We started meeting with her and really zeroed in on trying to examine the prosecutorial decision-making, and knowing that nationally this was the place in which the system would show the greatest disparities. Those meetings actually the pilot project never went on, and so the Maine State Advisory Commission picked up that work and held these hearings. As you can see, we had quite a good, diverse group of folks who joined us. One thing to note of particular importance is that this hearing included both formerly incarcerated folks, but we had the voice of a currently incarcerated person who joined us for this hearing and truly made it one of the most unique hearings that we've ever had, is to hear from people who were most impacted by this situation. So Brandon Brown, who's still serving time in the Maine State Prison, he was the president of that branch, and also Michael Parker, who was the founding president of that branch. So that made the hearing quite unique. I'll just jump to the actions.
Ms. Ross, the time for the presentation is over, but I appreciate the presentation, and I'm going to move us to questions from my fellow commissioners on the advisory memorandum.
This is Vice Chair Timmons Goodson. Again, we thank you for all of your work, but you indicated that early on that you had been able to make some progress with regard to the recommendations or on this issue. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Thank you for the question. I'll try to make it brief. Two really substantial pieces have come forward as a result of this. One is that we were able to close one of our juvenile detention centers here in Maine, and we're on the verge of looking to close the last juvenile detention center here in Maine, understanding that these are not the places for our youth, particularly with such disparities for youth of color. The ACLU, members of the Maine SAC, and other community action groups have really come together to address juvenile justice issues in the state. So we're looking to close the last remaining juvenile detention center in the state. The second thing that we've done is we are trying to re-engage the judiciary, corrections, and law enforcement in order to get data, comprehensive data, so that we can hold briefings with legislators. It looks like we are going to be able to re-engage those folks. The Supreme Court Justice has indicated a willingness to try to launch that pilot program. So we're really excited about that. And we have identified the Maine Lusky School of Public Service will do the analysis on that data. The third piece is that we were able to introduce two bills in this legislative session that were written by currently incarcerated men to address the issue of parole, not having parole in the state of Maine. We introduced a bill called Earned Time, which would, upon completion of a rehabilitation program, it would give inmates additional time. And we also introduced a bill on rehabilitation that would put in statute the pathway to rehabilitation so that we could address reintegration and reentry. So we've introduced legislation, we've helped close down a juvenile detention center, and we've re-engaged the judiciary, corrections, and law enforcement on data collection.
Thank you.
Ms. Ross, the second of the last bills that you just mentioned that would address reintegration and reentry is particularly piqued my interest because of pending investigation at the Commission about the collateral consequences of incarceration. And I would welcome information about the status of that bill after this legislative session if you are able and willing to share it with us.
Absolutely. I got to say that we're so proud, and I don't know where else this has happened, but we're really, really proud that in this legislative session we were able to introduce a total of 4 bills that were written by currently incarcerated men at the Maine State Prison, and the rehabilitation one is based on a proposal that was written by currently incarcerated men that we translated into a bill. That bill is now working its way through the Maine State Legislature, and I'd be more than pleased to keep you updated on the status of that.
Thank you. Any other questions from fellow commissioners? Commissioners on the phone? Thanks so much, Ms. Ross. We really appreciate your presentation and your work on the committee.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We'll now hear from our Illinois Advisory Committee Chair, Juan Carlos Linares, on the committee's report on civil rights and voting in Illinois.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. Good morning.
Great. Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity. The Illinois Advisory Committee also thanks you for this opportunity to present. And special thanks also to David Musat and Melissa Winarowski of our Chicago office, who were instrumental in facilitating this work for us over the past couple of years. I'm going to summarize then the impetus of why we went ahead and worked on the issue of civil rights as they pertain to voters in Illinois. And then I'll go over some of the findings for some of the sections that we pulled for the report, and then some recommendations. So the impetus of our work with regards to voting and civil rights really stemmed from the 2016 general election, the presidential election, where there was a lot of discussion, not just in the media, but directly from the White House, really, to discuss whether we go ahead and research if there was voter fraud, voters who were non-citizens who were going to the booths and voting. And we really found this as a compelling issue in Illinois. So to jump to one of the findings, we first, if you have the report, there's a section on voting rights in Illinois, and we talked about the specific law as it pertains to the local jurisdictions in Illinois. And just to jump to one of the findings, which addressed directly the impetus for our work, from 2000 to 2014, there was found no fraud in voting or voting from any illegal voting from non-citizens. In fact, from some of the panelists we heard, there is a broad awareness of non-citizens who are hoping to become citizens that voting is a deportable offense. So we saw no fraud coming from the panelists. At this point, let me pause to say that given the partisan nature that voting rights and civil rights can take, we were very intentional about selecting a panel that would provide a balanced overview of these civil rights issues as they pertain to voting. And I'm confident in saying that we achieved that diversity and bipartisan nature of the panels that we had. We heard from folks in nonprofit service agencies. We heard from people in policy think tanks. We heard from government officials and from folks who are general residents and voters, including those who are formerly incarcerated. So to jump to a few more sections then, we looked at a few content-specific issues with regards to voting rights, one of which was voting access among jailed inmates or the formerly incarcerated. Now, this is specific. This is very important in Illinois in that 56% of the incarcerated individuals in Illinois are African American, even though only 15% of the general population is. So there is this potential, just on the face of it, to look at issues of disparate impact. But what we found was very compelling. Illinois is one of 14 states that allows for voting automatically once the incarcerated have come out of being incarcerated. So that's 14 states, including the District of Columbia. All that said, we heard testimony, including from those who were formerly incarcerated, that mentioned that there is not a lot of awareness among prison jail officials for those who are not currently facing felony sentences, but those who are merely jailed before their trials. Those folks do have the right to vote, but there's just not an awareness amongst jail officials whether or how to operate these voting rights. I do want to say, since our panels occurred, the Cook County Sheriff, and Cook County is where Chicago sits, the Cook County Sheriff went ahead and does a mass voting exercise for early voting purposes with the jailed inmates for those who want to participate. There's also a lack of awareness with regards to distributing absentee ballots in the jails themselves. One very compelling thing that we found was with regards to what we call prison gerrymandering. So in one specific instance, there's a city called Pinckneyville in southern Illinois, where in that jurisdiction, there are more people incarcerated in that county than there are people actually living in the county that are not incarcerated. So the issue there is with regards to representative power, is that we are counting folks who are prisoners as residents of that county, even though they are not allowed to vote because they're serving felony sentences. So that was one very compelling.
Mr. Lawrence, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but just to pause for a moment. For folks who are on the line, if you are not speaking, could you mute your lines? We're hearing a little bit of back feedback. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Linares.
I appreciate that. I heard that too. So just to jump to a few more sections and then to summarize and wrap up, we also looked at voting access for limited English proficient voters. There specifically, there are some federal laws in place, including sections 203 and 208, which you'll find in the report. The issues there are with regards to section 203, how we count individuals who need language access on the ballots themselves. Specifically in the city of Chicago, which is one of those jurisdictions which triggers the language access, we have ballots in Spanish, in Chinese Mandarin, and in Hindi. But there are outlying counties where that number trigger either 10,000 individuals within that jurisdiction or 5% of that jurisdiction needing the language access. This will be an issue in the next census on how we count individuals. And then for section 208, this gets into the last section. So it's a mixture of the language access issue, where section 208 mandates that folks that need assistance at the ballot themselves can bring in someone to translate for them, someone who is not either their employer or a union steward. But the issue there goes with election judges. Election judges are often not trained enough to know what the rules are with regards to either bringing folks in to translate for them or a variety of other issues. This jumps to sections of the report on access for individuals with disabilities, or the homeless who don't always have that permanent address but are doubled up and staying with someone else, do have that address and may have to have different forms of identification, but the election judges aren't always aware. So jumping to some of the recommendations then that we found is, in order to ensure that the civil rights of voters are being met, the training of election judges is critical in facilitating the process of voting itself. There's also issues that we found from some of our government officials that when training election judges, there's not always enough money to do so, and there's not always enough money to pay judges so that we're getting the highest quality of folks that are willing to stay a 14-hour day to facilitate the ballot. So jumping to another recommendation then, we did have a brief discussion on campaign finance. And this is where I'll conclude with regards to the content piece, is we had some panel testimony with regards to those that donate under the Citizens United case, where folks are, candidates are free to receive amounts of money that aren't restricted under the Citizens United ruling. So, but what we found, particularly in the Chicago mayoral election, that 94% of the current mayor's funders were white individuals, and many of those male as well, and many of those upper income. So what we're finding then is a potential for policy to be drawn so that they're serving those donors and not necessarily the general public. This is something to be analyzed further, we think, under the Citizens United case and the results therein. So to conclude then, again, we thank you for the time. There are in Illinois a variety of content issues related to civil rights with regards to voting, particularly disparate impact amongst African Americans and those who are incarcerated. Also access to the ballot with regards to language, disability, or housing status. And at the end of the day, campaign finance being one of those that can perhaps see a disparate impact on how policies are written.
Mr. Linares, thank you very much for your presentation, and please thank your fellow committee members for the thorough and very comprehensive report on voting in Illinois. I really appreciate it. I want to open the floor for conversation from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Degway?
Yes, hello. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more of a flavor of how the implementation of Election Day registration has been going in Illinois.
Thank you for asking that question. So what we found when the panels were being conducted was the issue of automatic voter registration was currently in our legislature, and it had not been passed. But since we've had our panel testimony and since we've had drafts of the report going back and forth, the Illinois governor did sign automatic voter registration into law on August 28th, 2017. And what that says is anytime you go to renew your driver's license, you will be automatically be registered to vote if you're also a citizen of the United States. We also have some law that says that you're automatically registered, but if you're a small county, you can opt out. So this leads to maybe some disparate impact with regards to the smaller counties where their election commissioners can opt out of this law. Now, 20 of 120 counties guarantee this by virtue of the size of their populations, but we heard testimony from folks that in the southern part of Illinois, it's not a guarantee to have that automatic voter registration. So this could bring up some issues with regards to the fairness and impacts with regards to who gets to automatically register on election day.
And I take it that exclusion has something to do with the administrability of election day registration in smaller counties?
Yes, that's what we found. And so some of the counties can't fully staff their precincts or election jurisdictions with the numbers of people to be able to administer this. The larger counties more clearly can, but one of the issues becomes the funding of this mandate. Is if the state is able to fund this, then there probably shouldn't be this disparity. But these are all testimonies that we've heard. The facts remain that 20 of the 120 counties do allow for election day registration, and the rest can opt out.
Thank you. Mr. Linares, this is Catherine Lehman. I found very compelling the window into the experiences of voters and potential voters in your state that you included in the report, including, for example, the discussion about voter intimidation in Cook County that you had included at page 20. So thank you very much for making visible to folks who are outside Illinois experiences of people in Illinois. I also was struck in the report about one of the issues that the report raises with respect to voting rights of formerly incarcerated individuals, that even though Illinois automatically restores the voting rights, many individuals in this position are not aware of the restoration. And that's an issue that I heard about when I visited the Alabama State Advisory Committee's briefing also on voting rights. I'm interested in whether your committee considered a recommendation on this issue and how the current state of misinformation might be improved.
And thank you for your question. And actually, both parts of your comments are very much related into a culture of training not just election judges, but all policy officials into the voting rights in Illinois as they stand. So as you mentioned, voter intimidation, there's the one scenario in Cicero, Illinois, which is a near west suburb of Chicago, where police officers were present at the polls and were demanding that voters bring their permits, quote unquote permits, which are not really, it's not a real thing. It's not necessary to have a permit to vote. So that's one of the instances of voter intimidation. But again, it goes towards teaching not just the election judges as to what the rules are, but police officers, all government personnel, and anyone related to the voting system outright. We did hear from one individual who had been incarcerated that he was told outright by the local county jail officials that you cannot vote. And that was, he thought, not necessarily a malicious statement so much as it was the jail, the officer just wasn't really informed as to what the rules are and was just guessing and trying to keep people quiet during that time period. So to your question, one of the recommendations that we want to informally put forward is the better training of both not just the election officials, but of all folks who work in government and who work on policy.
Thank you. Commissioner Degley?
Hi, I have one more question with respect to the automatic voter registration effort in Illinois. Is it the case that effort is focused only on DMVs as opposed to other agencies?
So thank you for your question. To answer your question, and to my knowledge, it is focused on the DMVs at the current moment. But I am aware of discussions of either broadening that effort or further clarifying that. But to the extent that we heard testimonies, it is currently, yes, focused on the DMVs.
Because I take it one consideration there is whether that approach itself may have some disparate impact to the extent that there may be disparities in people who hold driver's licenses. And so that may be something worth further inquiry.
And thank you for your comment, because one of the findings in the report is that individuals who earn less than $35,000 a year, which are more likely to be seniors, those with disabilities, or people of color, are less likely to have either a driver's license or a state-issued ID. So thank you for your comment, because that is reflected in the report as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners, including commissioners on the phone?
Madam Chair, Kirsenow here.
Commissioner Kirsenow?
Thank you. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very informative. You stated at the outset, I think I may have misheard or didn't hear the entire presentation, but I think you said that you didn't find any evidence of voter fraud in Illinois.
That is correct. That's per the findings of our panel discussion, yes.
And how did you make that determination?
So we had several individuals, and we have the transcripts available too, I think publicly available. So I can't quote exactly who it was, but we had government officials, including those with the Cook County Clerk's Office, which administers voting, and those with the Chicago Board of Election. And I believe it was one of those individuals that looked at the study on enforcement and showed us that there was no finding of fraud in Illinois from the years 2000 to 2014, or any evidence of non-citizen voting during that time either.
Oh, well, thank you. It may in the future, if you look at this again, be a good idea to look at some media reports from CBS and Chicago Tribune that cite a number of individuals who have been convicted of voter fraud, including Mahmoud Vakili, an Iranian citizen who was convicted and sentenced to prison for voting while he was not eligible to vote. Stephen Kidd, who CBS says was sentenced for voting fraudulently pursuant to absentee ballot. Brian McDougal, 2 years in prison for falsified absentee ballot. Audrey Cook, Augustus Stacker, Pamela Boyd, Monica LaPlante. Sometimes the media has information that maybe Cook County doesn't.
And I appreciate that information and research. We will look into that. And again, we are relying on the government officials that testified with us. So thank you for that information.
Thank you.
Any other questions? With that, Mr. Linares, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you to each of the State Advisory Committee members who took the time to present to us and for the work that you've taken for your State Advisory Committees. It's always a pleasure for us to be able to hear from you, and as is reflected in the reports from today, it's a pleasure to see the wide variety of issues that the State Advisory Committees are taking up. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is discussion and vote on the timeline, discovery plan, and outline for our upcoming project for our May briefing titled In the Name of Hate, Examining the Federal Government's Role in Preventing Hate Crimes. Is there a motion so we can open the floor for discussion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Terrific. We'll now have a discussion on the motion. I'll start by offering my thanks to our staff for their research and hard work in putting together the materials and working with all the commissioners and commissioner special assistants to get to these final documents. Are there any other points for discussion before we vote?
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Harriet?
I know that both Commissioner Kursanau and I have made the point that this is too ambitious, that we've never been able to pull off quite so much work in one of our reports. And we have recommended that the part that's addressed to the Department of Education, which is not a crime-oriented area at all, would be best deleted. No action seems to have been taken on that, so I've assumed that a majority of the commission is of the other view, but I did want to point out that I predict that this is not going to be something that our staff can handle, and that we will be much better off if, at the very least, we cut back on the part that is related to bias incidents rather than hate crimes, since that's going to open a whole new can of worms with First Amendment issues, with all sorts of stuff. So I would, again, strongly urge that we get rid of that part.
Thank you. The materials reflect the proposal that we voted on as a commission that included the Department of Education, but I appreciate your sustained view on the topic too. Any other discussion? Okay. I'll call the question. We can take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbele, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I vote no.
Commissioner Kursanau?
No.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners opposed, no commissioner abstained, and all others were in favor. We'll now consider our amended business items, beginning with the statement on the Department of Justice Access to Justice Office. I'll turn it over to the Vice Chair to read the statement, and as is our custom, I take it you will omit the footnotes as you read so that we can move forward expeditiously.
Yes, please.
I will omit the footnotes. The statement is entitled, "The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights highlights the need for the Department of Justice to reopen the Office for Access to Justice." The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights calls on Attorney General Jeff Sessions to ensure the Department of Justice's Office for Access to Justice is fully operational and able to perform its functions. The office safeguards access to justice on behalf of people who cannot afford lawyers so that the justice system delivers outcomes that are fair and accessible to all, regardless of income. The Commission is concerned about reports that the Attorney General has functionally closed the office by reducing its staff and shifting its resources elsewhere within the department. We call on Attorney General Sessions to immediately reconstitute the office with dedicated staff and to rescind any efforts otherwise. Since its inception in 2010, the office has worked within the department across federal agencies and with various stakeholders in an effort to focus the country's attention on the right to counsel. To that end, the office has engaged in filing a series of statements of interest and amicus briefs related to access to justice issues, launched an interagency collaboration, and served as the U.S. government's central authority on access to justice. The work of the office was also critical in informing the Commission's findings and recommendations following our investigation into excessive fines and fees that target low-income people of color. In the area of fines and fees, the office multiple times convened policymakers, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and advocates to discuss how certain practices with respect to the imposition and enforcement of fines and fees can result in unlawful and harmful conduct. In addition, the office, along with the Department's Civil Rights Division, issued Dear Colleague letters to state administrators and Chief Justices in each state to provide greater clarity to state and local courts regarding their legal obligations. The Commission majority recognized in our report on fines and fees that these convenings and guidance letters influenced local and statewide reformed practices, increasing access to justice consistent with constitutional commands. The Commission is concerned that the work of the office in convening stakeholders, issuing guidance, litigating noncompliance, and serving as a central authority will end without dedicated staff. Ceasing that work risks ending, in practical terms, the mission of the Department of Justice itself for many millions of low-income Americans. Access to justice is core to effective democracy and also a core component Congress has charged the Commission with safeguarding. Thus, the Commission urges Attorney General Sessions to immediately shift resources back to the office and to rededicate the staff to the important mission of access to justice. Chair Catherine E. Lehman stated, and I quote, "The Department of Justice disserves all Americans by turning its back on access to justice for those with the lowest income among us. We strongly urge renewed, immediate fidelity to the core justice mission."
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Is there a motion so we can open the floor for discussion? I'll move. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the statement? Commissioner Harriet?
This statement seems to me to be premature. If we're actually interested in whether the Department of Justice is in fact doing what the statement seems to assume that it's doing, the best way to do that is through a letter, not by a press release of this sort. And so I would urge that this be recast as a letter to the Department of Justice. If the response that you get is not to your liking, you can always do a press release. But it's a little hard to see this document as sincere, given that it's not being phrased as a question. It may well be that the Attorney General is shifting even more resources to this topic just within the Civil Rights Division. I note the Civil Rights Division is getting a modest increase in its budget this year, even though the tasks that are assigned to the Civil Rights Division are less now than what they were a few years ago because of the Shelby County decision by the Supreme Court. So I would urge that this be done as a letter that's a true inquiry, and not a press release that's designed to cause the reader to assume what facts that aren't yet in evidence.
I thank you for that, Commissioner Harriet, and I too gave that some thought, but I'm of the opinion that time is of the essence. While what we're hoping to do is to have some effect on the decision itself. But
we don't know what that decision was.
And I'm concerned that if we wait and it's done, then we've lost whatever we could have done to have some say or word out on the decision.
My understanding, in addition, is that we've engaged in substantial efforts to find out the specific actions, and that the Department of Justice has not been forthcoming in
but
its
not a letter.
response. And it is my view that it is important for the Commission to fulfill its role to Congress, to the President, to the American people in addressing core civil rights issues as they come up in a timely manner, in a way to try to influence their operation. So I support issuing a statement now. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call the question, take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbolet, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
Of course I vote no.
Commissioner Kursanov?
No.
Commissioner Yaki?
No.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Of course, I vote yes.
And I vote yes. The motion fails because there were 3 commissioners opposed and 3 commissioners in favor.
Okay, with it having failed, might it be appropriate, Madam Chair, that I then offer this in terms of it going out as a letter under your signature, inquiring as Commissioner Harriet has sought? It failed. You're
amazingly persuasive, Commissioner Harriet.
I'm not used to winning on it.
You convinced Commissioner Yaki to come along with you.
Democracy in action.
Hang on. I'm sorry. I'm going to move to change my vote because I completely was not paying attention to what was going on.
Were you perhaps confused, Commissioner Yaki, and you intended to vote yes?
I was actually looking at a statement by Commissioner Kursanov on another issue, and I thought, no. So I apologize. I'd like to change my vote to a yes.
Okay.
I have no objection to that.
Thank you. But we are appreciating the levity, so thank you for that today as well. The motion therefore passes. 2 commissioners opposed, none abstained, all others were in favor. So thank you.
Thanks for that experiment in democracy.
And let's see how we do with our next statement. Let's now consider the statement about the Environmental Protection Agency and its decision regarding Uniontown, Alabama. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Yaki to read the statement, please.
And hopefully I won't vote no on my own thing. Fellow commissioners, as you know, this is an issue that this commission actually, unfortunately, perhaps foresaw in its report last year. This is regarding the dismissal of the civil rights complaints made by the residents of Uniontown, Alabama, from the coal ash deposits. And this is what it states. U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Statement regarding EPA decision on Uniontown, Alabama. As an agency that conducted its own fact-finding on environmental justice enforcement from the Environmental Protection Agency, we express our deep concern over the EPA's recent decision to dismiss two Uniontown, Alabama civil rights investigations without violation findings. Sadly, these dismissals continue the EPA's disturbing and long-standing track record, which this commission documented, of not making a formal finding of discrimination or denying or withdrawing financial assistance from a recipient for civil rights violations. After our investigation, which included meeting with and hearing from the affected residents of the Uniontown community, the commission found that the EPA's decision to allow the movement and storage of coal ash in Uniontown did not fully consider the civil rights impacts. We also found the storage of coal ash in Uniontown has adversely impacted the surrounding community. These latest decisions by the EPA perpetuate the environmental injustice the Uniontown community must endure. Environmental justice is a critical civil right that helps address the negative health outcomes in communities of color and low-income communities who are disproportionately affected by environmental pollution. We will continue to monitor the EPA's enforcement of federal civil rights statutes and find this is yet another distressing step in the wrong direction for the agency. The Commission's 2016 Statutory Enforcement Report, Environmental Justice, Toxic Materials, Poor Economies, and the Impact on the Environment of Low-Income Minority Communities, examined the EPA's work under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Executive Order 12898 with a focus on the civil rights implications of the placement of coal ash disposal facilities near communities of color and low-income communities exactly like, I just editorialized, not exactly, like the Uniontown, Alabama. In addition to the briefings held by the Commission in Washington, D.C., two additional meetings on topics were coordinated that year by the Commission's North Carolina and Illinois State Advisory Committees. Period. Understood.
Thank you. And whereas we typically don't read the footnotes, there is only one in this one, and it notes that both Commissioner Degdele and I did not participate in this investigation because it had occurred prior to our appointment. Thank you for reading it, Commissioner Yaki. We can now discuss the statement. Is there a motion so we can open the floor for discussion?
I so move.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson, I second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the statement? Commissioner Harriet?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by this statement. This is the case, I know some of you were not on the commission at the time. This is the case where we had planned an investigation to go down to Uniontown, Alabama, but it was abruptly canceled over my objections. This is one of those cases where at least one member of the commission tried to have the general counsel's office state that it would be an ethical violation for me to go down to Uniontown. In the end, I was the only commissioner to go to Uniontown. It was very clear that some of what we were told during the briefing here in Washington, D.C. was incorrect. Frankly, I thought that report was one of the commission's greater embarrassments. And so I am very surprised, given our level of expertise in this area, which is essentially nil, that we would be questioning the EPA's findings.
Any other discussion?
Chair?
Commissioner Yaki?
We had two briefings on this in Washington, D.C. North Carolina and SACS also held issues on this. Again, this is a pattern and practice by the EPA Office of Civil Rights through many administrations. This is not aimed at any single administration. This is something that we have found to be a distressing pattern ongoing, and this confirms actually our findings going forward. And I will say that one of the great things that came out, side benefits of our hearing on voting rights in North Carolina, is that we actually met with some of the folks from Alabama who drove up to talk about what an impact our hearing has had positively for residents in the community, and I think that this statement is amply warranted.
Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degdele, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
No.
Commissioner Kursanau?
No.
Commissioner Yaki?
Yes.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson,
Yes.
and I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners opposed, no commissioner abstained. All others were in favor. I see that we are just at 11 a.m. and we have our 2 scheduled speakers here with us. So I'm going to table the discussion for the rest of the business meeting to follow the presentation from our 2 speakers and invite them to come to their places at the podium, and we can begin our historical presentation. And then after that concludes, we'll return to the remainder of our business meeting. So as our 2 speakers are joining us, we are planning now to commemorate Women's History Month. And I will say that the long march toward full equality for women in this country continues and follows vision, leadership, and everyday acts of courage that are well worth remarking and celebrating. In keeping with our bipartisan tradition at the Commission, I also note that the women's equality effort has long been bipartisan and championed by strong leaders across the political aisle. Whereas feminism is often associated with the Democratic Party, I offer a few very recent examples of Republican leadership for women's rights. It was Republican President Nixon's Presidential Task Force on Women's Rights and Responsibilities that recommended adding sex discrimination to this commission's jurisdiction, which President Nixon supported in 1972. Former First Lady Betty Ford lobbied extensively for women's rights, and specifically for the Equal Rights Amendment, which has yet to be ratified, and was named Time Magazine's Woman of the Year in 1975 for her efforts toward women's full equality. As a child of that era, and having grown up with ERA Now, pins and stickers displayed at my mother's office and in our home, I especially appreciate her leadership. And more recently, Carly Fiorina proclaimed the Republican Party as the party of women's suffrage during her recent presidential campaign in 2016. I look forward to hearing more about the rich and varied history of this civil rights movement from our speakers today. And I appreciate the persistence of those who paved the way before me, creating the space for freedoms I and my daughters now enjoy. Our first speaker, Paige Harrington, is a consulting public historian and preservationist specializing in early 20th century women's history. As president of Paige Harrington and Company LLC, she advises museums on creative and practical strategies to integrate women's history into existing museum interpretation, exhibits, and programs. Harrington's forthcoming book, titled Interpreting Suffrage, Women's Equality and Racism at Museums and Historic Sites, will be released in spring of 2019. I look forward to reading it. Harrington is the former executive director of the National Women's Party at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, the founding co-chair of the Women's History Affinity Group for the American Association of State and Local History, and serves on the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative. She also advised the U.S. Congressional Commission on their exploratory study for an American Museum of Women's History as part of their Scholar Committee. Harrington holds 2 master's degrees from the University of San Diego, one in public history and historic preservation, and the second in nonprofit management and leadership. Our second speaker, Fatima Goss-Graves, is the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center. Ms. Goss-Graves has served in numerous roles at the National Women's Law Center for more than a decade and has a distinguished track record working across a broad set of issues central to women's lives, including income security, health and reproductive rights, education access, and workplace justice. Ms. Goss-Graves currently oversees the Center's administration of the Time's Up Legal Defense Initiative, which connects those who experience sexual misconduct, including assault, harassment, abuse, and related retaliation in the workplace or in trying to advance their careers, with legal and public relations assistance. Before becoming CEO and president, she served as the Center's senior vice president for program, where she led the organization's broad program agenda. Prior to that, as the Center's Vice President for Education and Employment, she led the Center's anti-discrimination initiatives, including work to promote equal pay and address harassment and violence at work and in school, with a particular focus on outcomes for women and girls of color. As I can attest, as having been on the receiving end of her impressive advocacy, she is widely recognized for her effectiveness in the complex public policy arena at both the state and federal levels, regularly testifies before Congress and federal agencies, and is a frequent speaker at conferences and other public education forums. Ms. Goss-Graves appears often in print and on air as a legal expert on issues core to women's lives, including in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Associated Press, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and NPR. Ms. Harrington, we'll hear from you first.
Good morning.
Your microphone turns on if you, thank you.
Got it? Okay. Good morning, Commissioners and Chair Lehman. I'm delighted to be here today and speak to you a little bit in honor of Women's History Month. I have prepared remarks, and then what I'm hoping for is some questions and maybe a little bit of a dialogue going back and forth. I think would be fantastic.
Terrific.
The women's suffrage movement officially began with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and continued through the ratification of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, which ultimately granted 26 million the right to vote. Early icons such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Mary Church Terrell knew that women could not better their own lives and the lives of their children and their communities without enfranchisement and equal rights under the law. The history of the National Woman's Party begins with Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who coincidentally met in England while they were in jail, picketing with the Pankhurst family. They were not encumbered by husbands or children, so they could travel to England and work on this important work. They were both white, educated, middle-class women, and they had the financial means and time to take on the cause. The Pankhursts used militant tactics like heckling politicians, smashing windows, setting fires in public trash cans, all to raise public awareness of their suffrage demands. When Paul, Burns, and the others returned to the United States in 1910, they were determined to bring these militant activities back and use them here. Alice and Lucy and many others began by planning the March 3, 1913 parade. The parade was meant to disrupt the arrival of the newly elected President Wilson on the eve of his inauguration. Instead, they hoped that the public would watch more than 5,000 women march from the U.S. Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. This type of spectacle was largely unheard of in 1913, and the public reacted very badly. The women were violently attacked as they marched. The police stood by and simply watched the riots unfold. Over 100 marchers were hospitalized, and ultimately the Fort Myer Cavalry had to be called in to disperse the crowd. By 1916, women had the vote in only 12 states, and Alice Paul and Lucy Burns officially founded the National Woman's Party. Through a sustained campaign of mass propaganda and nonviolent action, the National Woman's Party campaigned for a federal suffrage amendment. The organization brilliantly used cartoons, posters, pamphlets, and picket banners in order to educate the public, influence politicians, and fight back against the long-established hostility toward the suffrage campaign. The NWP very aggressively lobbied members of Congress. Now, they were not the first to do this. However, the strategic way in which they tracked their subjects made them very unique, and many organizations later adopted their strategies. The press often referred to their deadly political index, which in essence was really just a collection of index cards in which the NWP kept meticulous notes on every member of Congress. But their research was meticulous. They knew their hobbies, education, religious and family economic background, where they stood on suffrage, and also other issues. The NWP members who connected the interviews left detailed notes that speak to the thoughts of Congress at the time. I'll have two examples. He was so violently opposed as to even be hostile in his attitude. He opposes the amendment on the grounds of states' rights, but also on the principle of the everlasting inferiority of women. And second, a smart aleck of the worst kind. My interview was a complete waste of time and a sore trial on my patience. Beginning in 1917, the NWP began picketing the White House. For over 2 years, NWP members coordinated an ongoing demonstration in front of the White House gates. Thousands of women, known as the Silent Sentinels, came from across the country and took turns picketing and engaging in civil disobedience. They burned Wilson's speeches and silently held large banners for the president and everyone else to see, with slogans like, "How long must women wait for liberty?" and "Mr. President, what will you do for woman suffrage?" These banners and the pickets were aggressive, direct, and rhetorically brilliant, with slogans meant to inspire and engage. We take it as commonplace today for protesters to be outside of the White House, but until the NWP's picketing, this had actually never been done before. And so, as you can imagine, eager crowds would gather daily to read the new banners and to watch the spectacles unfold. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, public sentiment changed. Across the country, thousands of women turned their attention to the war effort, and many expected the suffragists to do so. But the NWP felt otherwise. During the Civil War, suffragists had put their cause on hold, and many felt that it had held them back for decades. The banners they carried to the picket line became more inflammatory, basically labeling President Wilson a hypocrite for fighting a war of democracy abroad while not protecting women at home. One very powerful banner slogan was, "Mr. President, how long must women be denied a voice in government, which is conscripting their sons?" They even called him Kaiser Wilson, which, as you can imagine, did not go over well and actually resulted in attacks on the suffragists. The police again made no effort to stop the attacks or to apprehend the attackers. At the request of the administration, the police began to arrest the suffragists. These were well-known social advocates and prominent society women, in some cases middle-aged or older women who were arrested on charges of obstructing traffic. Ultimately, over 2,000 women picketed the White House. 500 were arrested and 168 were imprisoned, either at Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia, or in the District of Columbia Jail. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners. Instead, they were met with brutality. They were fed meals that consisted of sour bread, half-cooked vegetables, and rancid soup with worms in it. When the women went on hunger strikes, they were strapped down and forcibly fed. The oldest, Mary Nolan, was 73 when she was arrested and jailed. The public and press reacted with outrage and sympathy toward the women. By 1918, the NWP's tactics, the backlash from their imprisonment, and the persistent lobbying eventually forced President Wilson to endorse the 19th Amendment as a war measure. In 1919, both the House and the Senate passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed into law, granting 26 million women the right to vote, and it only took 72 years. Under Alice's leadership, the NWP then turned their attention back to Congress. They worked on hundreds of pieces of legislation that secured marriage rights, the right to have custody of their own children in case of divorce, the right to education, the right to own property, the right to keep their own wages, and over 100 more. Most notably, in 1923, the NWP produced a new piece of legislation, the Equal Rights Amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The NWP continued to work for more than 50 years to end the legal, social, and economic discrimination against women both here in the United States and abroad. From 1929, when the NWP moved into the Sewall Belmont House, it became the principal center for women's rights activism through the 30s, 40s, 50s, both nationally and internationally. The NWP was, for many years, the only national organization committed to raising the legal status of women through the Equal Rights Amendment and other pieces of legislation. Some examples include the 1922 Cable Act, which impacted women who lost their citizenship because they married foreigners or resided abroad. The repeal of Section 213 of the National Recovery Act of 1932, which eliminated the barring of federal employees working for the government if their spouses were also so employed. 1963 Equal Pay Act made it illegal to pay women lower rates for the same jobs strictly on the basis of sex. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and Title IX, education amendments prohibiting discrimination against girls in federally funded athletic programs. By the 1930s, the National Woman's Party was operating the House as a public museum and sharing the history of suffrage. In order to protect the House and continue sharing that history, the National Woman's Party began yet another campaign, this time to secure recognition for the House as a national monument. So 39 years after Alice Paul passed away, the House became the first national monument named for two women, NWP benefactor Alva Belmont and Alice Paul, and the first named for women's equality. On Equal Pay Day of 2016, President Barack Obama declared the Sewall Belmont House was now the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, so that generations of girls and boys would hear the story and be inspired. In partnership with the National Park Service, the NWP remains in the House and is the principal steward of the archival collection of over 30,000 artifacts, including many of the original banners that I discussed. The NWP also remains a public convener, hosting programs and discussions that focus on women's equality. Within the first year under National Park Service, visitation was up 75%, and the House has already undergone assessment for upcoming preservation projects. However, there is still much work to do before we note the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020. In this very limited summary of the NWP's campaign for suffrage, you'll notice that there were very few references to the many women of color who also worked for suffrage. And until now, I haven't even mentioned the vast racial and economic discrimination of the movement. For example, the African American women who marched in the 1913 suffrage parade, including Ida Wells Barnett and many women from Howard University, had to march at the back of the procession. Wells, of course, did not agree and marched instead with the Illinois delegation, but the vast majority of women did. In the early years after the Seneca Falls Convention, the American Woman Suffrage Association worked toward universal suffrage. However, as the decades passed, the larger suffrage associations, including the NWP, bowed to pressure from their members in the South, who were interested only in the voting rights of white women. Because the women of color were excluded from the larger organizations, they're also largely left out of the interpretation at historic sites today. And many of their documents and artifacts are not included in archives and repositories, which makes their stories incredibly hard to find. There is, however, great work being done. National Park Service and NWP are jointly working on research that will yield materials and information and allow a more accurate interpretation of suffrage that can then be shared with the visiting public. Scholars and historians, including myself, continue to research and publish on this subject, and grassroots organizations like Chick History in Tennessee and the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel are actively working to digitize family records of African American women during the suffrage campaign and make them available for research. The goal being that when the exhibits and programs and celebrations focusing on the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020 will finally share the accurate and honest story of the suffrage campaign, one that reflects all communities and is inclusive of all voices. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Harrington. Ms. Cosgraves.
So thank you so much for having me at the commission, and it's really an exciting time, I believe, in the women's movement and the movement for gender justice broadly for a few reasons that I will promise I will get to the history part, but I want to just sort of set the table about where we are now. And part of the reason that it is exciting is because we, I think, are growing to have a different understanding about the real importance of organizing and doing work at the intersections of gender discrimination, but the way it intersects with many other forms of oppression. And there are also new leaders in this work whose longtime advocacy to improve the lives of women and girls is coming to the surface, and their names are getting known and will hopefully be documented in our history. And there is a different level of energy, the sort of energy that led to the greatest mass mobilization that we've seen in our nation's history, with a women's march that centered the experiences of women of color. And women themselves are engaged as activists in new ways. They are leading both in making calls to Congress. They are leading in who shows up at town halls. Women lawyers, which we're really excited about, are leading in their volunteerism, and women in both parties are running for office in record numbers. And so for the work we do at the National Women's Law Center, which was founded 45 years ago, to be doing this work in the middle of such a vibrant and energetic understanding and such very serious attention to women and girls' lives is really exciting for all of us. And one of the things that's happening right now is that women are leading conversations and really standing in solidarity and trying to break the silence around harassment and violence and the ways in which it impacts their lives. And that has come to prominence through the framework of Me Too. And most of you probably here have heard about Me Too, but I'll just say a couple of things about it. It was the longtime rallying cry that was developed first by Tarana Burke in her local organizing to let survivors of harassment and violence know that they were not alone and that there was collective, that there could be healing and joy in coming together as a collective and understanding that you were not alone. And yes, Me Too. It was amplified in October, and millions became to share their experiences in digital spaces and then in real life, and now it's showing up at institutions. But it also has been the space where many first learned about harassment and violence in deep ways, and the ways in which it touched so many institutions, the ways in which workers working in the lowest paid jobs in restaurants and hotels and on farms actually had a lot in common with those who were in the upper paid jobs and even those who were working in Hollywood. And that common understanding is what galvanized a coalition of initially 300, but far more now, entertainment influencers and attorneys to create an initiative that's designed to help low-wage workers connect with attorneys who could represent them in harassment and related retaliation cases. And that is what became what is now the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. I will just tell you a couple things about the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. It, in 2 months, has raised over $21 million to support these types of cases. But what I have been truly inspired by is the way people have showed up to support. We now have almost 700 attorneys who have joined with us to say that they will be willing to take on these cases. We've had over 20,000 people contribute to the fund in increments as small as $5, which is really their way of saying, I want to support this effort. And we have had over 2,000 people contact us since January 1st seeking our assistance. Really bravely. Many people, unfortunately, are calling us too late because they have been reliving experiences that were long ago. And so some people are calling us to just tell their story so that someone knows. They now know that something that happened 5 years ago, there's not a lot of protection for you under our federal laws, but they wanted to still name their experiences. So for us, it's really just extraordinary to be living in such a vibrant period and doing this work where in a time where we really feel like it's a moment that stands to push institutions to no longer engage in the historic shaming and blaming and silencing of survivors that has occurred historically. And as exciting as I find this movement and this moment, I have been thinking a lot about the many people over time who laid the groundwork for where we are today. And in many ways, their stories and the stories of the leaders in particular have been really critical points in time and have not really gotten the prominence. So I'll start, thanks to Oprah. We now know the name of Recy Taylor. And Recy Taylor was a Black woman who was kidnapped and gang raped by 6 white men while leaving church in 1944. And took at the time the very unusual step of trying to seek justice through the criminal justice system. And although 2 grand juries failed to indict, the outrage about this unaddressed violence sparked critical mobilizing around the country. And that mobilizing seeded the groundwork for the Montgomery bus boycott built on decades later. So when we think about Recy Taylor's story, many of us didn't know it in modern times, but those of us who are steeped in this work really believe we are building on the power of sharing those sorts of stories and experiences to mobilize people into action really broadly. I also recently have been reminded of Carmita Wood. And Carmita was a Black woman who was, at the time, refused unemployment insurance on the grounds that the decision to leave her job at Cornell Lab after years of sexual harassment was a personal decision. It was personal reasons. So she did not qualify, they said, for unemployment insurance. But that did not stop her. She worked with advocates and lawyers to form what was then called Working Women United, and it was one of the first organizations to really lay the foundation and language for sexual harassment and frame the issue of sexual harassment as not a personal issue for people to deal with, but as a matter of discrimination. That's critical for the moment that we're in. Part of what we're dealing with now is a cultural shift where people are thinking about harassment and violence as not just personal issues for people to contend with by themselves, but structural issues, including as ones that are covered by our discrimination laws, that are going to require also structural solutions. It's also important to remind us of Michelle Vinson. Michelle Vinson was also a Black woman who was working as a bank teller, who stood up to her employer and brought the case that established in the Supreme Court that harassment was protected under Title VII. When she brought that case, her bank's defense was essentially that she was either lying or promiscuous and dressed really provocatively, or all of those things. The court rejected those arguments. And, you think back to that period of time that, Michelle Vinson carried the weight of not only working there for so many years and enduring this sort of abuse, but also the abuse of standing up to your employer and hearing reflected back to you that all of these things that are so steeped in race and sex stereotypes were cause for you not to have a claim. It also reminds us of Paulette Barnes, who worked at the EPA and also stood up to her boss. Her case led to the Federal Court of Appeals finding that sexual harassment constituted sex discrimination under Title VII before the Vinson case. And this case really led the first legal groundwork and framework for so many cases to come for us to understand how harassment really is a form of discrimination covered by our civil rights laws. And it is all of their bravery that paved the way for Anita Hill to testify in 1991, and for now the millions who are saying Me Too. I also wanted to let you know about someone who's very near and dear to the National Women's Law Center, and that is LaShonda Davis. LaShonda Davis was our client, and she stood up to her school in the Title IX case that established that schools have an obligation to address harassment. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She was in 5th grade, and she reported harassment and unwanted touching repeatedly to her teachers and to the school. Her parents reported repeatedly, and the school's response was effectively, kids will be kids, boys will be boys. Her parents complained for months, and after months, the only resolution was to move LaShonda to the back of the classroom. Finally, her parents found a suicide note. There was no investigation into the claims. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that schools, yes, did have an obligation to address sexual harassment and set forth the standard for doing so. But that case was important for so many other reasons. It was really the national rejection of the idea that, the concept of kids will be kids or boys will be boys is a thing that should happen and unchallenged. It was also it rejected the idea that was pervasive at the time that there was nothing that schools could do in response. And it also is a good reminder of the powers of students and parents and all of their supporters to be able to speak up and challenge practices that they see as unfair and that leave students feeling unsafe. And LaShonda's bravery and her family's bravery really led the groundwork for an exciting and vibrant student-led movement 20 years later. And when those students took their schools to task and took the government to task for failing to put the sort of systems in place for preventing and address sexual violence, they were building on the work of LaShonda Davis and her family. So it's worth pointing out one other group of women whose stories don't get told very often, and that was a group of iron workers who joined together to challenge sexual harassment in their workplace. And they became together the first certified class to pursue a class action sexual harassment claim against their employer. And again, understanding that harassment is not just a personal, private problem, that it sometimes can be a systemic problem that affects many different employees together. These and so many other leaders really showed their ability to change the way we think about issues that undermine women's lives, and they led the fight for law and policy change largely quietly, with few people knowing their names. Today's leaders, I believe, are also following in their footsteps and helping us to rise and frame how we should be experiencing this current moment we are in. And I'm going to just name their names so that we begin to have more of a record and memory of who they are and the work that they are importantly doing. So whether that is Tarana Burke, who organized for so long under the Me Too framework and has really emerged as a national North Star, reminding us about the healing journey for survivors, and that is as important as any other conversation. She also reminds us to organize with joy, which is an important thing for our movement. Or Monica Ramirez, who really graciously steered hundreds of thousands of farm workers to support and align with Hollywood. She really reminded us of the power of women working on farms when she sent a letter to Hollywood starting Dear Sisters. That letter basically said, we know your experiences because we have shared those experiences too. And rather than saying, and our experiences are worse because we're doing it in conditions that you can't imagine, she said, we've been organizing for decades. We're here to fight with you for your fight. And we're here for this shared fight. That is really, that collective approach in so many ways is what inspired Time's Up to not just be about the entertainment industry, but to be about all sectors. Or Saru Jayaraman, who long ago helped us all to make the connection between harassment and tipped wages that restaurant workers are subject to. She constantly reminds us that any solution to harassment at work must also address the underlying conditions that mean that harassment is prevalent. So for the work we do, I don't want to suggest that these are easy times, but as the work continues to push our culture, our laws, and our policies through, I think a lot about who our modern day Reese's and Michelle's and Paulette's are, and I have no doubt that so many other new voices will rise in this time and working to try to secure a world where women can work where they want, attend schools where they want, with equity, with dignity and real safety, and lead the lives that they want without the sort of conditions that diminish us all. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to any conversation and questions.
Thanks very much to both of you. I really appreciate both of your presentations, and I'll open for questions and comments from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Harriet?
I would like to say a word on behalf of the great state of New Jersey. You mentioned Seneca Falls, which of course is where we date the beginning of the women's movement. But in 1776, the New Jersey Constitution actually was rather ambiguous about whether women could vote. It used the word inhabitants. There were other requirements as well. But in 1790, New Jersey had a statute that very clearly allowed women to vote. It used he or she. It's kind of a mixed story in New Jersey, but it's a fairly interesting one. But women were voting in New Jersey in in the late 18th and early 19th century. I think in about 1707, there was an election where there were accusations of fraud, and there were some accusations that men were voting twice, once dressed as men and then once dressed as women. I, of course, cannot comment on the truth of that. New Jersey ended up repealing that law, but nevertheless, there was a period where New Jersey was leading in this area. I also should say a word on behalf of Wyoming, and that is the first state to enter the Union with women voting. Congress originally balked at the notion of admitting Wyoming because they thought this would be a bad example across the country to have a state where women were voting. And so they said, hey guys, if you get rid of this women's suffrage thing, then you're going to grease the wheels a lot more quickly. And the Wyoming legislature, to its everlasting credit, cabled back to congressional leaders, and I've written it down here so I'll get the words right. We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without the women. And so eventually Congress relented. And by the end of the century, there were 4 states that allowed women to vote, all mountain states. So go mountain women.
Fascinating.
Madam Vice Chair?
Yes. Ms. Harrington, I listened to you talk about all of the efforts that were put forward that eventually led President Wilson to support the 19th Amendment. And I found myself thinking back to the ERA and all of the efforts made during my lifetime to get that amendment passed. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on why we've been unsuccessful in passing the ERA amendment.
So it is, there are definite parallels, I think, between the suffrage campaigns and certainly the campaign for equal rights. It's astonishing to most people, and I'll say, I was the executive director of the National Woman's Party for about 9 years. And in all of the tours and all of the hundreds of times that I've led people through that house, they say 2 things to me that just never fails to shock me. The first is, why didn't I learn this in school? To that I can't. I know a lot of reasons you didn't learn it in school. I didn't learn it in school. I didn't learn it till graduate school. And the second is, they almost always assume that the Equal Rights Amendment was something that was put forth and passed and is part of the Constitution since the 1970s. So the vastness of these campaigns and how long it actually takes to get this change to happen is really shocking for a lot of people, especially younger people, because they're thinking, my goodness, 1923, the 70s sounds like ancient times, right? to most kids that are in high school today or college. It is. So it is very fascinating. But, I think that for one thing, it's complicated. And 2, just like the suffrage campaign, there were very many factions working on different things. And there was not a lot of unity to really push it forward. The Equal Rights Amendment has had there's been a lot of resurgence. There's been a lot of talk about it, certainly in the last few years. Nevada just passed the Equal Rights Amendment. I think it was 2016 or early 2017, which leaves 2 states, if they were to ratify, and the time limit was eliminated, then we would have an Equal Rights Amendment. But a lot of people still don't agree with it because they believe that a lot of the blanket protection has already been done in other pieces of legislation and policies. And I know that Ms. Goss-Graves can certainly speak to that much better than I can. But I do know that there are still organizations that are working on it and do believe that, again, we're not equal under the law, not yet.
Madam Chair, may I ask one more question? Sure. This one is for Ms. Goss-Graves. Thank you for the names that you've shared with us and the tremendous work that they did and the debt that we owe all of them. But as I listened to you talk about Reese Taylor and Carmita Woods and Michelle Vincent and, all the others, I found myself wondering what is it that these ladies had in common that gave them the courage and whatever else to go forward and to stand up and to complain. And then selfishly, I asked, how can I get a hold of some of that?
Well, I also want that too, but I will. I'll maybe answer your question a little bit differently, because sometimes when people are coming forward, and we've been finding this in the many intakes we have gotten, when they take those first steps, I don't know that people always know the range of things they're about to confront, right? They're seeking fairness, and many times people sort of think, it should be fair, so I should just be able to do this thing. And so the fact that they were also not just able to initiate, but also endure through many, many hurdles, not just legal hurdles, but also the sort of shaming that many of them dealt with, and to the extent that there was public reaction, and it was sometimes negative public reaction. And recently, the Washington Post talked a little bit about what it was like for Michelle Vincent when she brought her case at the time, and there was coverage about what it is she wore to the Supreme Court argument, and coverage about and debate about is it really illegal to not want to sleep with your boss? There at the time when people were trying to establish these principles firmly in the law, and there was a lot of cultural unsettlement and not legal clarity. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just saying it, in some ways, it was even harder than you can imagine, because there wasn't the certainty. And when I think about the people who are coming forward today, where there is more legal certainty on a number of fronts and have long been the case for decades, yet they have these experiences that don't get addressed by their employers. So one of the questions that we are asking ourselves now really deeply is where that disconnect is. Why is it that when their survey data is as high as 1 in 3, and in some sectors even higher, people say, yes, I've experienced harassment at work, and actually, no, I probably wouldn't report it. Right. So why there is this disconnect, despite our current legal framework?
I think your response has helped me define more clearly the question that I'm trying to ask, and that is, what is it that these ladies had in common that in fact allowed them to endure what they were later subjected to?
Yeah, one thing that is the case for several of them when I've read about their backstory is that they all had really strong family support as they were coming forward. And so even though you have, in some cases, a public rejection, there was family support, and that was true. And Anita Hill has even talked about that, the deep family support that she had during her testimony. So that might be one factor.
Thank you.
I'm really struck listening to both of you about the efforts that you both have made and that the organizations you work in have both made to give voice to, give visibility to the wide variety of people who have populated this effort and this struggle. And I appreciate in Ms. Harrington, in your historical perspective, the conscious effort to explain that this is not only a white women's movement, that this is a movement that all women have participated in, and that movement has included much tension about that topic as well. And Ms. Goss-Graves is in your discussion now about making sure that today, this is a movement that reflects all of who women are and is inclusive in the civil rights effort. I think that resonates for me. And also, I so appreciate, Ms. Harrington, your effort to ensure that at the 100th anniversary, we will be able to see and hear and have context for all of whom all of whose shoulders we stand on now, and what brought us here. I also was struck in your last answer, Ms. Cosgraves, with the notion of the strength of a family support, in contrast, Ms. Harrington, to what you said about two women who were unencumbered by spouses and children in their ability to move forward. And I think that makes me think that we think of families in broad and narrow terms, right? And the ways that I imagine they had support that led them able to move forward, but at a time when spousal or children support would have been an albatross, and that would have been an impediment. And I hope maybe you could speak more to that.
Right, definitely. So it was, when we think about family, we think about our biological family, or the families that raised us and that we lived in. And a lot of the suffragists did have supportive husbands, and they did have children at home, but the support in their own relationships allowed them to do this work. But I think with Alice and Lucy in particular, they had a singular focus to making sure that this was going to happen. And in order to do that, they had to make that their main focus. And so they lived in, there were 5 different headquarters. The one at 144 Constitution, which is now Belmont Paul, was the final headquarters. And they had 5 headquarters where they all lived. So they had dormitories. Women would come from across the country to learn how to lobby and how to picket. And of course, remember, in the 1930s or the 19-teens, there wasn't an American Express card, and you couldn't just pick up, your Southwest rewards card and head over to Washington, D.C. And a woman, especially alone, certainly couldn't do that. So for her to have a community, a family that was built into the National Woman's Party was a big part of that. And the other organizations were very similar. And we see this in all types of organizations, certainly. But I think for them to move it forward in that short amount of time, after having peaks and valleys and certainly languishing for 60 some odd years, I think that it took that type of attitude to push it forward no matter what, to ensure that it was done. Now, interestingly, Lucy Burns left the movement after the 19th Amendment was ratified and went back to her family. And Alice Paul did not. She continued to stay. She lived in the house at 144 Constitution until probably 1974, and then she passed away in 1977. So still today, we have women that would come in and say, when I was a 19-year-old co-ed and I was here in the 70s, I walked up those steps and Alice Paul answered the door. That's phenomenal. That was her only, the only thing in her life that she wanted to do was work toward equality for women. Now, she did not look at it in an intersectional way that we, of course, would look at it today. And so there are issues that are a little bit harder to resolve. But you do have to say the circumstances in her life gave her the ability to stand there and do that work with many others, but to do that work really until she passed away.
I wonder if the two of you could reflect also on, in particular, what Ms. Harrington, you described about the violent opposition to some of the equality efforts, and they seem, with the benefit of hindsight, like pretty core equality components. Yeah. That the right to vote or the right to be recognized as a full person. When you included the quote about the everlasting inferiority of women, obviously that does not strike a chord for me right now. But the notion of both physically violent reaction as well as psychically violent reaction to the efforts that these women led and persisted through, I think is also a theme that rides through what you've described in the case discussions, Ms. Cosgraves, of the specific people that you identified, and the pre-litigation discussion that begins with Recy Taylor, and that's a history that's hard to hear and also hard to reflect on in this moment, especially when we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment still. I mean, some of the core tenets that garnered that violent opposition are tenets that we have not yet achieved.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and I'm just sort of thinking about this right now. One of the reasons we may not know their names is because for some of them, they sort of retreated a bit after their experience, and they did experience very serious threats against themselves, against their broader families, for coming forward and bringing these cases, for naming experiences of harassment and violence and inequality, that came at personal risk, but that also came at family and in some cases community risk.
It is amazing to think that something as simple as voting today, or the ability to vote today, was so controversial for so many years. I appreciate, Commissioner Harriet, the remarks that you made about even prior to 1848, because there were states and there were territories that did allow women to vote. It seems like sometimes equality ebbs and flows. Sometimes we make progress and then again, it kind of swings back a little bit. As far as the violence was concerned, particularly during World War I. So the women were very much expected to give up that campaign and to retreat and to go back and work for the war effort. And many, many, many of them did. But again, the leaders of the NWP thought that that would just set them back even further. So from the public's perspective, you have Washington, D.C., outside of the White House. You have sailors and soldiers that are returning from or on their way overseas to fight in World War I, and they're seeing these women stand there and picket with banners that say things like Kaiser Wilson. Now, the Kaiser Wilson banner did not survive, shockingly. There are supposed to be a couple of small fragments of it at the Smithsonian, but it's not, we're not sure. But a lot of the other ones did, which always amazes me that we have this collection of almost 1,000 textiles that survived, because the women were beaten, horribly beaten. And that's while they were on the street. That's not even what happened when they were jailed. So it really is astonishing. There are women that talk in their firsthand accounts about being forcibly fed. Their teeth were knocked out, right? They're strapped down. They have these big tubes shoved down their throat, irritating everything. And then the vomiting that just took place. So just the small snippets of what I've shared with you are absolutely horrific. It is not unlike plenty of other people in many different circumstances when they're fighting for rights that these same types of things have happened. So it is a little bit shocking to think about it as something as simple as being able to vote. I always try to make sure that I share with people, this is a right that we have, and it is also a responsibility. So to vote, to be civic minded, to be civically engaged, to make sure that you're educating yourself and voting, no matter what you vote for, just make sure that you do engage and you do vote.
Thank you. Commissioner Deckley?
Yes, both of your presentations were so full and rich of layers of history that are important. And so I'm trying to synthesize some lessons from the history that can help us think about how we go forward. And I have two questions in mind. The first is that obviously laws and enforcement and education and practices all come together in a range of civil rights contexts to protect equality. And I'm wondering if you have views from the history about how the relative contribution of these pieces have advanced or stood as impediments to women's equality. Why don't I pause with that one, because there's a lot in there, and then I'll come back with the next one.
Well, one thing that I think about is I fully agree with you that it's usually a mix of law and policy and culture change, and that sometimes you have one out there leading far ahead of the other, and it takes a while for the other to catch up. And I think we have seen that for sure in the area around harassment and violence in particular, where there were some legal shifts, but the cultural shift hadn't yet fully happened. So the Vinson case where the Supreme Court said, yes, Title VII covers sexual harassment was 1986, but the EEOC didn't actually start to receive significant levels of harassment charges until after the national conversation following Anita Hill's testimony in 1991. So that, that period of time, it was sort of on the books, but not actually made very meaningful. And the converse is sometimes true as well, where you have a really rich cultural conversation, but not yet the legal framework or administrative framework or even the institutional changes that would make these cultural conversations real and lasting. And the moment we are in right now is extraordinarily cultural, right? There are conversations happening at every level. And there are some policy changes that are happening. You had just last month, the House, in a bipartisan way, finally fixed its sort of extraordinary system that it had had in place for 20 years to deal with discrimination complaints against the House of Representatives. And, there were all sorts of barriers that were built in. Like there was, a waiting period before you actually filed a formal complaint where you had to get counseling and be really, really sure you wanted to do it, and mandatory arbitration, all sorts of things that don't happen in the private sector, where you wouldn't say, yes, you need to really think hard about filing that complaint. You need a cooling off period. No one would build that in today in the private sector. So they have made changes in a bipartisan way in the House to address that. That would not have happened but for Me Too. And there have been bills to fix that for decades. So it wasn't as if there wasn't an idea to fix it. But there's a lot of work to do to catch up with the cultural period we're in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I will add that to loop back to when we were talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, in the 1970s, when there was a lot of opposition for that, and ultimately it was not ratified, a couple of the main issues that women did not support it. Would there be no maternity leave? Would girls have to register for the draft the same as boys when they turned 18? Would we have unisex bathrooms? Would women serve in the military? Would they serve in forward zones? Well, a lot of those things, if you just think about just those few things that I've just named, within the last 15 to 20 years, a lot of those things have already sort of been culturally decided. We've talked through them, communities wrangle with them, we make progress. And now those things aren't nearly as upsetting as they would have been in the 70s and especially in the early 80s as well. So you're right. Sometimes there's the legal framework, and then sometimes there's the practical side. What does culture want? What does the culture want? What type of change can the community withstand and still emerge? So a lot of those things just have to work themselves out. And perhaps that is maybe a silver lining to why things take so long, because some of those other questions just sort of naturally get taken care of. We still have plenty of things to work out as far as that is concerned, but some of the bigger ones are not necessarily such a big deal today.
Great, thank you. And my last question is, I have two teenage daughters, mm-hmm. and I'm thinking about pieces of this wonderful presentation that I can bring back to them, and indeed that we can be sharing more broadly with people across the country. And so I would ask if both of you have a couple of core lessons from the history of the struggle for women's equality that we should think about as we take this fight forward. Are there any distillations of the history that are important to think about as we push forward to get to the next place in terms of women's equality in the country? And hard question, but mm-hmm. I'm open to any thoughts you may have.
Well, I would say certainly for teenage boys and girls, it's important for them to understand that that history did not just unfold out of the pages of a textbook. These were actually real people that were grappling with real different and real difficult situations. And each person who played a role in that had a choice to make of what side of history they were on. And ultimately, it comes down to knowing yourself, knowing what you find valuable, and then making sure that you're educated about that and moving forward to make sure that those rights or the inequality is worked forward so that you're not leaving others behind. But I think to let them know that it's real people just like them who are making these decisions is very important. And the second, I would say, is to get engaged. And I'm terrible with names and I'm terrible with dates, so I became a historian. But it's not all about dates and names. It really is about what those stories make you feel, how you make that connection. So historic sites are absolutely amazing, as are museums. And I would say, just taking the time to go explore those resources that you have in your own community, that also helps broaden your thoughts and will lead you to being more true to yourself and more true to what you actually believe in and want to work for.
those are very good lessons. And I will echo one thing that you said. It's that individuals really matter, and I think about in the moment we're in, how powerful it has been for each silence breaker to tell their story and realize all of a sudden you're not an individual, you're in a full community. And then the second thing is a lesson that we are still learning in the women's movement, and that is that our true equality really requires it to be for all women.
Yes.
And that, there have been beautiful fits and starts over that. Real question over time, do you take an inch if that means cording off one population or another? And I think that the lesson around caring and pushing for full equality for all women is one that we should be not just remembering but implementing going forward.
Thank you both. I want to make sure that our commissioners on the phone have a chance to ask questions if they have any. Commissioner Harriet, you have
Do we have time for another one from me?
We do, but it sounded like there was one on the phone too.
Yeah, hi. I want to thank the speakers very much for the presentation today. I really don't have any questions other than to just note that everything that happens is related to everything else, and the courage and the bedrock upon which we stand today is in part because of the work of these early pioneers. But I just wanted to note that one of the pioneers in the 80s and 90s and up till today, Representative Louise Slaughter, just passed away.
Yes.
She was the author of the Violence Against Women Act, which had a dramatic impact on raising the issue and reducing domestic violence in our country. And she was a friend of mine and a true champion, and someone who proudly stood in the shoes of those who came before her.
And she was, until today, the longest serving member of Congress.
Yes.
We're marking her. Commissioner Harriet?
I wanted to go back to what Ms. Harrington was saying about the Seneca Falls Conference.
Yes.
And, you're right. We trace the history of the women's movement back to that point because it was a single event.
Right.
But there were also things that were going on just before that and that included the Seneca Falls Conference. And it connects up to our commission. We are the Commission on Civil Rights, but civil rights meant something different in those days. They had a definition that basically was civil rights on the one hand and political rights on the other.
Right.
And so when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was talking about, we should argue for voting rights, at first, Lucretia Mott said, I think I'm quoting here, oh, Lizzie, you'll make us look foolish. But they were more focused on civil rights. And to them, that meant the right to own property. And the right to be sued. And they were focused not on all women, but on married women.
Right.
Because under common law at the time, single women and widows already had those rights, but married women did not. And in particular, the right to be sued doesn't sound like a great idea. It sounds like, oh, who wants that? But when you think about it, no one will lend you money if you cannot be sued to get that money back. So that meant that married women couldn't operate farms, they couldn't operate their own businesses, and we were living in a frontier society where we think of divorce as all too common today. It's sad, but desertion was a big problem then. Men would just pick up and move west, and their wives would be left back in the east with no means of support unless they could borrow money. Right. And so that was hugely important. The New York Married Women's Act was in 1848, I believe. You're nodding yes, so it sounds like I have the year right. And so that was a huge movement and one that doesn't get enough attention today.
Right. It is important to remember how different the world was at that time. And it's just like the vote seems very simple. At that time, if a if a person died, if a man died, and he left his estate he couldn't leave his estate to his daughter. She could not inherit. There was no land ownership. She could.
Oh, no, she could.
She could. But if she was married.
If she's married, then it's her husband.
It's her husband's, exactly. And if he deserts her and takes everything, that's okay, because it was his, not hers, when it was really hers. So those types of very simple connections with family and what was legal is incredibly different to think about today. And I think maybe that is part of what we all need to think about, which is anytime multiple decades goes by and you're working for progress, you're impacted by the newness of each of the new decades. And what we should be doing is thinking we are much more wise today. I am much more wise today than I was 10 years ago, than I was 20 years ago, etc. I should be using that viewpoint then to view the world in a more complete way, most definitely. And part of it is just to say, history is still, we are still thinking differently and learning things about history, but even so, these are similar issues that we have today, and everyone should think about it moving forward as well. So not just what it was, what we didn't have, but what we are today and what we still need to get. I think it's that longer time frame or view that I think is incredibly important.
Lovely. With that, I will thank both of you for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us today. We do have some more items to complete for our business today, but let's take a 5-minute break so we can take a moment to have a photograph with our panelists, if they will, before they leave us, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes to complete our business meeting. Thanks. Panelists, I didn't ask if you were willing, but I'm sure you will. Okay, I'm going to return us to our record. We will next return to our agenda items, and next in it is to consider a statement about the White House's budget request for fiscal year 2019. I'm going to start us, even though Commissioner Degbolet hasn't yet returned. He is recused from this statement. I'll first read the statement that we will consider, and that is, the members of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights are dismayed that the administration's proposed budget for fiscal year 2019 again drastically cuts civil rights enforcement across key federal agencies. The Commission urges Congress instead to prioritize federal civil rights enforcement resources. Available data reflects growing need for federal enforcement of civil rights. Yet the White House not only fails to seek increases in funding for its agency's civil rights enforcement work, it instead proposes dramatic cuts in funding and personnel, and to reduce the federal role, even in serving as a critical backstop against harm to vulnerable Americans. For example, the Department of Education touts limiting the federal role in education as a highlight of its budget proposal. Despite reports of an increase in racial harassment and hate crimes, the administration proposes to eliminate 27 additional positions in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, 23 investigative positions in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and 75 positions in the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs in the Department of Labor. The administration's budget request proposes to slash the budget of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services by 20%, $8 million below its budget for the last 2 years. None of the White House's proposed budget increases is directed at increasing civil rights enforcement. Even where Congress rejected the administration's proposed cuts to civil rights enforcement last year and provided for an increase in such funding, the White House now seeks $1.1 million less funding, even than Congress appropriated specifically for that purpose in the current fiscal year. Likewise, the Department of Health and Human Services projects an increase in civil rights complaint receipts in the coming year, but the administration proposes not only significantly decreasing its budget, but also compounding its workload through creation of its new Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, without addressing how this division's budget and staffing will impact the Office for Civil Rights' ability to carry out the other critical portions of its mandate. The White House budget also proposes to zero out the budget of the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service and transfer its functions to the Civil Rights Division. That transfer would further reduce the functional budget of the Civil Rights Division, which the administration already proposes to cut by 27 people, by adding to its workload without funding that work. Of further concern, CRS provides critical services, as the budget request itself acknowledges, to assist communities with preventing and resolving tensions and violence related to discrimination, including violent hate crimes committed, quote, on the basis of actual or perceived race, color, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, or disability. An essential function of CRS is to act as a mediating presence in communities experiencing conflict, combining its functions with the Civil Rights Division, which investigates and prosecutes offenders of civil rights laws, could harm the effective function of CRS. In addition, the administration's budget request proposes to cut nearly $3 million from the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Fair Housing Initiative's program's Education and Outreach Initiative. This program, as part of HUD's efforts to provide fair housing enforcement and education across the country, funds critical efforts to inform the public on the rights, responsibilities, remedies, and resources available under the Fair Housing Act. The dollars lost in this program, nearly a third of what was allocated the last 2 years, could have a devastating impact. Recent news reports that the department is considering removing the language in its mission statement that HUD is, quote, to build inclusive and sustainable communities free from discrimination, end quote, compound the Commission's concern regarding reducing funding specific to fair housing. Secretary Carson promises that HUD will continue its legal and rightful role in protecting Americans from housing discrimination, whether or not the mission statement includes that commitment. However, removing the formal commitment to non-discrimination, while also proposing to reduce funds, signals a retreat from the equity mission of the agency, harming communities around the country who depend on HUD to ensure they are not subject to discriminatory and unequal access to housing. These proposed cuts and failure to prioritize civil rights enforcement reflect a dangerous departure from the federal role in protecting core rights to which this nation has committed and recommitted itself over the past 60 years. Last June, the Commission unanimously approved a comprehensive 2-year assessment of federal civil rights enforcement, which will conclude in fiscal year 2019. The ongoing review examines the degree to which current budgets and staffing levels allow civil rights offices to perform their statutory and regulatory functions, the management practices in place in the offices, and whether these practices are sufficient to meet the volume of civil rights issues within the office's jurisdiction, and the efficacy of recent civil rights enforcement efforts from the offices. Though our assessment is ongoing and our final report will not issue until the close of fiscal year 2019, the administration's second budget proposal is, as its first one was, deeply alarming. Chair Catherine E. Lehman states, the Commission urges Congress to reject this administration's retreat on civil rights and instead to appropriate funds at the level necessary to ensure effective enforcement of federal civil rights so that we might all live the promise of the justice and equality for all. Congress and this administration, if it were appropriately focused on fair representation of all Americans, could balance all American interests to ensure equity and fairness through the budget. We can now discuss the statement. To open the floor for discussion, I move that we approve the statement. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the statement?
Yes, Madam Chair, I wonder if you would consider in the title, I would propose that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights urges Congress to prioritize civil rights in the fiscal year 2019 budget, as opposed to what's currently written.
I accept that proposal. Thank you. I think it's an improvement over what I had. Any other discussion on the statement? Okay. Oh, Commissioner Harriet.
Thank you. I just want to say that I intend to vote no on this motion. For example, the Department of Education, it states the Department of Education touts limiting the federal role in education as a highlight of its budget proposal. I support that, and I think a lot of Americans do. I note that the Civil Rights Division's budget has in fact been modestly, the proposal is to modestly increase it, although it does bring in issues that weren't previously before the Civil Rights Division. And so I could go on here, but I have a feeling I'm going to lose this vote too. So why don't we just get on with it?
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion?
Kursanow?
Commissioner Kursanow?
Thanks very much. I just would note that expenditures of funds don't necessarily equate to efficacy. The amount of funds apparently expended on, quote, civil rights enforcement under the Obama administration went up significantly, admittedly, but there are a number of studies, including by Indiana University Law School, that showed that despite that fact, the number of enforcement actions taken by the Obama Justice Department in areas such as education, housing, and employment were down, and in some cases significantly down, from the similar period under the Bush administration. So I think money is nice, but money isn't the be-all and end-all. And I would also note my being perplexed that only 75 positions are being eliminated from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs.
Meaning you would have expected more to be eliminated? Commissioner Kursanow, or did we lose you?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
So I was asking, did you expect that there would be more eliminated, or I didn't understand what you were perplexed about?
Yes.
I see. Thank you. I will say I share your view that the budget's far from tell the whole story, and that it's important to examine how the dollars are used and how effectively the dollars are used, and that there are good questions to be asked about whether more dollars are spent wisely and whether less dollars can be spent efficiently. So I wholeheartedly share that view and think that is worth examining, and I look forward to our ongoing examination of that over the next year. And I think that it is hard to imagine doing civil rights work effectively in these agencies with the cuts that are being proposed. And so I think it's also important to state a concern about budgets that are more sufficient than this proposal allows. If there there's no further discussion, I'll call a roll call vote. My understanding, Commissioner Degway, is that you are recused. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Commissioner Harriet, how do you vote?
I vote no.
Commissioner Kirsenow?
No.
Commissioner Yaki?
See, this is a problem. You have two no's right in front of me, so of course that confuses me. Yes.
As contrarian as you are, I think it would give you clear direction, Commissioner Yaki. Thank you. Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners voted no, 1 commissioner is recused, and all others were in favor.
And I think Kirsenow was using a mind meld on me on that other vote.
Definitely. I'm certain that's what it was. Commissioner Yaki, I think we have a statement from you to look at next.
Yeah, actually, it's a letter that sort of builds upon the statement that we'd issued earlier. This is regarding immigration enforcement actions in courthouses. It's a letter from the Commission to Thomas Homan, the Deputy Director and Senior Official performing the duties for the Director of ICE. Dear Deputy Director Homan, the undersigned members of the United States Commission on Civil Rights write to express our continuing concern with U.S. immigration and customs enforcement policy allowing immigration enforcement actions inside courthouses and its dangerous consequences that undermine our judicial system. The Commission previously issued a majority-approved statement raising concern that conducting immigration enforcement actions inside courthouses instilled needless additional fear and anxiety within immigrant communities, discourages interacting with the judicial system, and endangers the safety of entire communities. We've attached our statement for your consideration. ICE's recent guidance on when and how we'll conduct civil immigration enforcement actions in courthouses is a step in the right direction, but falls short of ensuring the fair administration of justice and the safety of communities. Specifically, ICE's policy does not consider courthouses sensitive locations, such as it has for schools, hospitals, or places of worship, where ICE will conduct immigration enforcement actions in limited circumstances, such as exigent circumstances, but will generally be avoided. The failure to classify courthouses as sensitive places is perplexing, but ICE's sensitive location policy is meant to enhance the public understanding and trust and to ensure that people seeking to participate in activities or to utilize services provided at any sensitive location are free to do so without fear or hesitation. The failure to exclude courthouses from ICE enforcement actions achieves exactly the opposite effect and prevents victims of violent crime, domestic abuse, and work exploitation from seeking justice. The policy unnecessarily increases the disruptive presence of ICE agents in courthouses, sowing fear and mistrust of our justice system among immigrant and vulnerable communities when such enforcement actions could be conducted elsewhere with less harmful impact. Moreover, immigrants such as family members and friends accompanying the targeted immigrant community may still be arrested on a case-by-case basis. Finally, the policy does not apply only to criminal immigration enforcement actions and does not further distinguish which immigrants would be targeted for criminal enforcement actions. As an independent, bipartisan federal agency charged with advising the President and Congress on civil rights matters and the administration of justice, the Commission strongly urges ICE to reconsider its guidance on courthouse arrests and classify courthouses as sensitive locations. Thank you for your consideration. We look forward to your response. Hugs and kisses, the Commission. No hugs and kisses. Okay.
Hugs and kisses were, of course, hyperbole, but okay. So do we have a motion so we can open the floor for discussion?
So moved.
And do we have a second? I'll second it. Do we have any discussion on this letter? Hearing none.
Kirsenow here.
Oh, Commissioner Kirsenow.
Yeah, I'm almost inclined to sign on just based on the fact I'd like to sign on to something that ends with hugs and kisses. But aside from that, just 3 observations. First, I just note that absent from the letter is any evidence of any action taken by ICE that falls within our jurisdiction. There's no evidence, at least deduced in this letter, or shown to have been deduced in this letter by the Commission that the ICE's courthouse enforcement efforts discriminate or deny equal protection on the basis of race, color, sex, or any other protected class. And also, as we do with other letters or several of us have made the point that it might be advisable to defer to the expertise of the relevant agency. In this case, the experience and expertise of ICE in what constitutes a quote-unquote sensitive location for purposes of effective immigration enforcement. And also, courthouses are not considered sensitive locations, insulating American citizens or lawful residents from arrest if they're otherwise in violation of the law when they enter a courthouse. So we're treating here in this letter illegal immigrants in a more elevated or protected status than that enjoyed by American citizens when it comes to insulation from courthouse arrest.
Thank you, Commissioner Kursanow. We do, of course, have jurisdiction over administration of justice, and the access to courthouses is core within our jurisdiction. I don't know if others have other questions or other responses. Okay, I'll call the question, take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbolet, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I vote no.
Commissioner Kursanow?
No.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye with hugs.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes with hugs as well. The motion passes. 2 commissioners voted no, no commissioner abstained, and all others were in favor.
But there's not a majority in favor of hugs, which I'm very disheartened to see.
I'll bet you could get the majority on hugs and kisses. It's the letter that's the problem.
We'll have to add that to our next agenda, since that's not an agenda item, but I'm sure we would be unanimously in favor of expressing love. Next, returning to management and operations, we'll hear from the staff director, Maral Morales, for our monthly staff director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the interest of time, I thank you, and of course, in the interest of time, I have nothing further to add beyond what is already contained in the report. I'm always available to discuss any matter with a commissioner if they see anything in the report they'd like to get more information on. However, I would like to take a moment to recognize the service of our spring interns. 2 of which are still seated here in our audience. One of them just stepped out, Shimang Zhang. She's a law clerk to the special assistants and is currently supervised by Commissioner Cladney. We should have additional interns coming in over the summer. But we also have Kristen Painter. Please stand up, shake to say hello and wave. She's at the University of Texas, and she's currently with OCRE. And we also have Elizabeth Boyle. She's an undergrad at the University of Notre Dame. Please stand up. Thank you, ladies, so much for coming and for helping and providing the research that you've done. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily important to what we do here, and we thank you. We hope you're learning and have when you go back to your institutions, you'll have some additional knowledge that will help you in your career. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We also have 2 that are not here. Laura Gavarder, she's with OCRE, and we have, I know I'm going to mispronounce this name, but we have Sue Lee, she's with the Office of General Counsel. And Ms. Zhang had just joined us, just wave at the commissioners again. Thank you. We expect to have an additional number of interns this summer, and we'll recognize them as they come in. But all of you, thank you so much. And the fact that you're all women during Women's History Month is amazing. So thank you for coming and participating and learning about civil rights and being, hopefully someday practice wherever your careers take you, and you'll always recognize the importance of civil rights. So thank you very much. And with that, Madam Chair, I have nothing further. And
thank you, Mr. Staff Director. I also do want to add my thanks to our staff for their insistence in setting up today's presentations and making this meeting, as all meetings, run as smoothly as possible. Very, very grateful for it. So thank you. And with that, I adjourn our meeting at 12:29 Eastern Time. Thank you all.